You're listening to an archive edition of River to River. I'm Ben Kiefer. There are a handful of lawyers in American history whose cases you and I benefit from every day without knowing their names. Cindy Cohn may be one of them. She grew up in central Iowa, moved to San Francisco, fell in with a crowd of early internet hackers, and ended up arguing successfully that computer code is protected speech under the First Amendment. That 1996 ruling made strong encryption legal to publish, which is why your phone, your bank, and an app like Signal can protect your information today. And that was just the beginning. Over the next 30 years, Cohn became the leading legal voice of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. EFF is a nonprofit that fights for your digital rights. And Cindy Cohn helped grow EFF from a scrappy group of hackers and lawyers into an organization of more than 120 people. Now she's stepping down as its executive director, and she's written a memoir that is part legal history, part personal story, and part rallying cry. The book is Privacy's Defender, My 30-Year Fight Against Digital Surveillance. I asked Cindy to start our conversation by reading from the introduction.
Cypherpunk Dress-Up Day. As I rounded the corner from the elevator on the 19th floor of the Federal Building in San Francisco, I could see that the crew that gathered in front of Judge Marilyn Hall Patel's courtroom was definitely not your normal courthouse fare. Standing and even sitting on the majestic marble floors were well over 30 people, mostly pale white men in their 30s with longish, stringy hair. They were uniformly scruffy and awkwardly dressed in suits and ties. They all seemed to be in outfits that their mothers had picked out for them for a family wedding. Or maybe I was projecting. I was 32 years old, worried about my hair, and wore a suit that my mother picked out for me from the Denver department store where she worked. They may have been a motley bunch, but they warmed my heart. They were there to show support for me as I argued a case called Bernstein versus Department of Justice. It may not have looked like it, but it was obvious to me and that crew gathered on a cool San Francisco morning in September 1996 that what happened in that courtroom would be crucial to the future of the internet. How Judge Patel ruled would play a major role in determining whether people would have privacy online. I must have seemed nervous because my co-counsel, Jim Wheaton, looked over at me. He touched my elbow and said quietly, "You're in your mother's arms." With that, I pulled open the heavy wooden doors and walked into the courtroom.
Cindy Cohn, an Iowa native, reading from her new memoir, Privacy's Defender, My 30-Year Fight Against Digital Surveillance. Cindy Cohn, welcome to our program.
Thank you so much.
That's delightful that first part of your book, read the first page of your introduction. Let's talk a little bit about your origins, and we'll get up to that point as well, one of your early court cases. The book opening there in a San Francisco courtroom, but you trace your thinking about privacy back to central Iowa, growing up in Newton. Then you went to the University of Iowa. Talk about, first of all, growing up here in Iowa as an adopted child in a Jewish family, in a mostly Christian community, and how that shaped what privacy meant to you before you even, I suppose, thought it was a legal concept.
You grow up in a small town and everybody kind of knows who you are. There's good things for that and not so good things. I mean, the good thing is, growing up in Newton, I could walk into any store in the town square and say, "Please charge that to my dad." And it would happen because everybody knew who my dad was, and it was easy to make those things happen. We didn't really lock our doors very much. I mean, this is in the late 60s, early 70s time frame, but and I had my bicycle and I could have the whole town. But the downside of that is that everybody knows who you are. And in my family, my mother had some mental illness. We were the only, there were a few Jewish families in town, but we were among the only ones. And so we were different. And I kind of, always felt like, that was something that was very obvious. And then my parents got a divorce in when I was about 12 or 13 years old. And that was kind of that was big news in the little town in a way that felt pretty uncomfortable for me. And so I think that I started recognizing that privacy is kind of one of the ways that you can protect yourself.
Mm.
You can protect yourself from, community judgments, from being the subject of gossip, but also, in ways as I got older that I saw were, important for things like democracy and being able to have self-government and basically being able to exist as people who are a little different than the normal folks, especially in a very small place.
Cindy, you write about a high school incident where you were required to perform religious music, and this is at a church Easter service, and this is in a public school. A lawyer named Mr. Lewin intervened on your behalf. Tell us about that story.
I've changed folks' names, so that's not Mr. Lewin's regular name, real name. But yeah, this was my best friend's father, and I was a singer. I was a soprano in the choir, and we sang a lot of religious music. That's okay in small doses. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But it started feeling like that was all we were doing, and it reached this climax where after having done the Christmas concert, which was all Christian music. And there wasn't really an effort to try to mix in Jewish musics, but by my high school choir teacher. When I was younger, some teachers had done that, but not by the time I got to high school. And then, we were presented with the Easter choir that we were going to do at a local church, and I felt uncomfortable with that. I felt kind of like a fraud singing this religious music in a church on Easter Sunday. And so I asked Mr. Lewin what he thought about it, and he said, "Well, that they can't make you do that. That's not okay. This is a public school, and they can't make you go to a church and sing." And he stood up for me. He went, and I don't actually know what happened, but I know that I was excused from that
Hmm.
performance without it having an impact on my grade. And I just experienced this rush of feeling about somebody actually standing up for me. When there was a kind of policy or an approach to things that just didn't feel right for me. And it's one of the moments that cemented for me that that's kind of who I want to be for other people. I want to be somebody who stands up for people who may not fit in exactly, but still have rights, and still should have them respected.
Right. And not just anyone standing up for you, but someone with legal knowledge. That was powerful because it
Yep.
suddenly made the impossible possible for you, right? It sounds like it.
Absolutely. And I had wanted to be a lawyer before then, but kind of in a kid's way. I loved Mr. Lewin, and he used to take us water skiing in the summer. And I thought, well, that's a great job because, my father was a traveling salesman and he wasn't around to take us water skiing. So I thought that that was a great job. And then, of course, as I got older and Mr. Lewin stood up for me and used kind of the power of legal argument, on my behalf, that became something that really cemented what I wanted to do.
You said you wanted to be, law interested you, but you were an English major before you became a lawyer going to the University of Iowa. How did those two things connect? How did you evolve from English to law? A love of
Well,
language and storytelling is, I guess, what they have in common, isn't it?
absolutely. And the ability to use language in ways. Yeah. I mean, I think, in my heart, I would still love to be a novelist one day. I loved reading when I was a kid. I kind of felt like when I got to the University of Iowa and I realized that you could be an English major and get a degree in reading, I kind of felt like I was getting away from, with something because, that was something I did anyway. But the University of Iowa is just an amazing place if you care about words and books and letters, and with the Writers Workshop, but also the whole English department was so rich. I really loved it. But I think I came to a decision after a couple of creative writing classes that I didn't know that I had the goods to be, to go right into being a writer. And so I also wanted to stand up for justice and do what was right. And so law seemed the obvious next choice for me. I also, in undergrad, started taking a couple of classes at the law school in international human rights law from a professor there who's now passed away named Burns Weston. Um, and I was, I was equally intrigued by both options, and ultimately, law seemed like the one that was calling to me more, and also was the one where, I would, my father would be a little less worried about me being able to pay the bills.
Wow, we have that in common. I took two classes from Burns Weston myself, and he shaped my desire to go to other places in the world. So that's interesting. We overlap there a
Yeah,
little, Cindy. He
he
was,
he was an amazing guy,
yeah,
right? I
oh
mean, he
yeah,
really reached in. I was just an undergrad, and I went to go see him because somebody recommended I talk to him, and he just took me in. He let me audit his class. He really was an inspiration, and I know that his legacy continues on there in Iowa City.
let's jump ahead a little bit in your life. You arrived in San Francisco, I believe, in the early 1990s, and you describe in your book you found yourself at a housewarming party full of hackers. What was that
Yep.
moment like? What was that world like? And what about that community drew you in, even though you weren't sort of a technology geek at this point, I guess, right?
No, I was not. I just thought what they were doing was fascinating, right? It's hard to remember because this is the 1990s. It's before the World Wide Web. I had just come back from Switzerland where, I would count the minutes on the phone to be able to talk to my parents before it got way too expensive. And these people were coordinating, communicating, working together over vast distances using this internet, using this network, and able to, have these ongoing conversations with people, regardless of whether they were nearby
Yeah.
each other. And they were already starting to think about what the world would look like when the everybody got access to this technology. And I just thought it was fascinating. They were interesting people. They were also kind of misfits, and again, I've always felt like a misfit. I've always felt a little drawn to them.
Yeah.
So having met this kind of community of misfits and learning what they were up to was just fascinating. Of course, I started dating one of them, and another one of them, as it turned out, John Gilmore, was founding the EFF right about that time. It was really a time of great excitement and change in the kind of technical world. And I just happened to meet them at that moment.
Back with more of my conversation with Cindy Cohn after a short break. I'm Ben Kiefer. It's River to River from IPR News. You're listening to an archive edition of River to River. I'm Ben Kiefer. Today we're listening to my recent conversation with Cindy Cohn. Cohn grew up in the central Iowa community of Newton in a Jewish family in a mostly Christian town. She studied English as an undergraduate at the University of Iowa, then earned her law degree and began her career at a small firm in California. She first became involved with the nonprofit Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF, in 1993. She joined EFF full-time as legal director and general counsel in 2000 and has served as its executive director since 2015. She announced that she will step down from that position by mid-2026. And she's written a memoir that is part legal history, part personal story, and part rallying cry. The book is Privacy's Defender, My 30-Year Fight Against Digital Surveillance. At this point in our conversation, we were talking about what it was like when email was new in the early 1990s. Yeah, and it's really interesting now, even with decades past, we have to kind of recall what it was like just to have. I was in Germany in the early 1990s when you were in San Francisco, and I remember distinctly getting my first email
Yep.
address. It was a CompuServe. I don't know where that company went. And it was literally just a number, I think, that was my address. But I remember typing in something and then an answer from the other side of the world instantaneously. It's hard to imagine now with all the things that we have. That was really incredible, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was very magical. And I felt like, there was an opportunity to use this technology to try to help make people more empowered. give people a bigger voice in their lives, give people, I just come out of human rights work, kind of give, where you struggled to get information out of repressive governments and people would try to sneak stuff out to get information out to the rest of the world about what was going on. And so I immediately started thinking about, well, what if everybody had this kind of technology? What would that mean for
Hmm.
the people who I had been trying to help when I was in Geneva? And I think that we found a lot of common cause. Again, we didn't agree on everything, but we found a lot of common cause in this thinking about what were the possibilities of this new technology.
I want to talk in a moment about some of the groundbreaking cases that you were involved with and you argued here. But first, I think we have to lay a bit of a foundation and go back to the title of your memoir, Privacy's Defender. You describe privacy not as something you want when you have something to hide, but as a check on power. Explain that framing because I think a lot of people listening, and I certainly hear it, that, I think I've said it before myself. I have nothing to hide. Why should I be worried about privacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a common feeling. And so, yeah, let me start with what I think privacy is, because it's a little different than how some people think about it. Some people think about privacy as like the Harry Potter cloak of invisibility that you throw over your head when you're about to do something you don't want people to know about. That's true. Privacy can give you that, but to me, that's not really why it's important. It's important because privacy gives people with less power some protection against people who have more power. And I think of this in small ways and large ways. In small ways, for instance, my colleague here at EFF, Eva Galperin, works with domestic violence victims who find that their abusers are putting spyware on their devices in order to maintain control over them, find out what they're doing, make sure they're not planning to try to escape, that kind of very direct and scary spying by abusers. And these people need privacy in order literally to save their lives sometimes and to plan to get out from under the thumbs of people who have more power than them and are using surveillance to try to keep them under control. And then you can go all the way up to governments. We have a secret ballot in the United States so that nobody can force you to vote for the people that they want you to force for. And that's a historical problem. Sometimes it's somebody's boss, sometimes it's somebody in their household, sometimes it might be the government itself that wants to stay in power by forcing, themselves to win the election, even when that's not what people would choose on their own. And it comes up in social change. We've lived through a lot of social change in my lifetime. All the public campaigns for social change kind of had to start with a private one. And I remember a time when, people would talk about maybe rights for LGBTQ people, gay rights, and they had to be quiet about that because it was dangerous to be talking in that way. And before we had the public parts of those campaign for gay rights, there had to be private conversations. And I think if we want to continue to have the ability to take control of our government, to change our culture and our social ways, we have to have private spaces for people to talk to each other, to associate, to gather together to try to make change. And that's the zone that privacy protects. And I think it's worth standing up and protecting. I think it used to be pretty easy for most people to say, well, if I have nothing to hide, I have nothing to fear. I
Hmm.
think we're living in a time where it's becoming more clear that the people who are being targeted for repression is moving fast, right? It didn't, before the Dobbs decision, people who weren't seeking reproductive help didn't think that they were the targets of surveillance. But since the Dobbs decision overturned Roe versus Wade, there's an increasing number of people who are finding that the lack of privacy in their digital tools and in their lives can be quite dangerous
Yeah.
for them. There's a mother and a daughter in Nebraska, just to the west of Iowa, where the mother went to jail for talking with her daughter over Facebook Messenger about an abortion that the daughter was seeking. And, that's not something that I think that people would have thought would be risky to do before the Dobbs decision really changed the tune. And we're seeing this with some of the the protests against ICE and the government now, where we're seeing government agents start to try to track, who's on the government side and who's not on the government side, and, claiming they're going to make domestic terrorism databases for people who are exercising their First Amendment rights to observe law enforcement. So I think that story might not be one that m many people can keep for the long run, even if a lot of people told themselves that in the short run.
Right. And let me jump on another, I'm sure, common reaction that you have because you said things are moving so fast. And you push back hard against what you call privacy nihilism, the idea that the surveillance here is moving so fast, so pervasive, that really fighting back is pointless. But isn't there a version of the nihilist argument that's hard to refute? The data's already out there, Cindy. Companies already know everything. What do you say to someone who genuinely feels it's too late?
Well, I mean, look, I guess I think a couple of things. One of the things, if you talk to the people who are trying to surveil you, they're not done. They don't think they've got everything because your life is going on and they want 360 surveillance of you moving on into the future, right? And so they're not stopping. Why would we stop in terms of thinking about how to protect ourselves? It's that's just not how surveillance work. The information that is most recent about you, what you're doing, what you're buying, who you're associating with is the most valuable, and the older information isn't. So the sooner we stop it, the less valuable all that surveillance is. I mean, that's just kind of as a matter of usefulness of the information. So I think this idea that it's all over and we've already lost it and it's all out there isn't actually true. And if it were true, you'd see them stop spending all the money trying to surveil us going forward.
That's a
Like
good
so,
point.
so I think I mean, that's kind of a very simple answer to that. But also, this isn't a problem that is all that old. I mean, we've solved harder problems as a country. We ended slavery. We brought the vote to women. We've changed things that took a long, long time to do. The rise of the surveillance business model and the massive surveillance of Americans that's happening right now is probably, depending on how you count, 20 years old. We can put a stop to it. There's some fairly simple things we could do to put a stop to it, like banning the surveillance business model and requiring a Fourth Amendment probable cause warrant for the government to get information that, about your papers, and in your home. I think those kinds of things would not be all that hard to do, hard as in like complicated, as much as it requires political will and the willingness to, vote in people who will vote for things that protect our privacy.
Hmm. If you just joined us, my guest this hour, Cindy Cohen. There are a handful of lawyers in American history whose cases you benefit from every day without knowing their names. And Cindy Cohen may be one of those, an Iowa native from Newton, became one of the country's foremost digital rights lawyers, outgoing executive director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, goes by the acronym EFF. Her new memoir is titled Privacy's Defender, My 30-Year Fight Against Digital Surveillance. Cindy, we won't have time to talk about all these pivotal cases that you've been involved in. But I'd like to go back to Bernstein versus the Department of Justice. This is in the mid 1990s, where a UC Berkeley math PhD student wanted to publish his encryption algorithm online. The federal government had classified encryption software as a munition here, publishing it without a license. That it saw that as a munition could make him an arms trafficker. You took this case and argued that computer code is protected speech under the First Amendment. Walk us through what was actually at stake in Bernstein versus the Department of Justice.
Yeah, I think you did a good job summarizing the context. So I represented a math PhD student who wanted to publish some computer code online that helps keep things secret. And the founders of EFF, the friends that I met at that party in my house in the early 90s, we're realizing that the internet didn't have a lot of security or privacy built into it, and that trying to add security and privacy was running into this problem with the US government treating encryption software as a munition. And so they targeted getting people to have access to encryption as one of the kind of prerequisites to building an internet that stands with users, and that isn't full of surveillance and security problems. And so we took this case and we really listened to what was going on online. And, encryption is something that's really important for us as end users to have privacy and security, but it's also a science. And it develops like science does, with one person publishing their ideas, other people taking a look at it, publishing their criticisms, and back and forth, right? The
Hmm.
scientific method that we all learned in fifth grade. I learned from Mr. Stone in fifth grade. Those kinds of methods were already in the 1990s happening in the digital world. And my client, Dan Bernstein, wanted to participate in that ongoing development of the science. But he needed a license from the government that would not be granted for strong encryption, which it was at the time. So we challenged on the grounds that computer programs are protected speech. Publishing a computer program is something as part of speech, and in this instance, as part of science, which has always been a part of speech, and scientific development, and that the government's rules requiring a license for that did not meet the First Amendment standards. And this crazy bunch of hackers showed up with me in court. We presented a lot of information to the judge, and we were very lucky. We got a judge that was willing to sit and listen to what we were saying about this coming digital future. And she agreed with us
Hmm. And
that the government's regulations didn't do it, and we won in the Ninth Circuit as well. And that's why, people have, that's why you can buy things online and not worry
exactly.
about your credit card being stolen. It's why people who use things like Signal or WhatsApp or even Apple Messages have encryption in those messages. It's why when you turn off if you lose your phone, you don't lose all your data on the phone. Why? Because the phone encrypts itself when it turns off, so that if somebody finds it, they don't have your face or your passcode. They can't get into it, and that's part of the ways that you stay safe. So encryption's kind of built into a lot of the things that people rely on right now, and part of the reason for that is because we were successful in the 90s in getting the government to drop its regulations.
Let's jump forward to 10 years at least when this started. NSA surveillance, mass surveillance. You filed two major cases against the NSA's mass surveillance program, one against AT&T and one directly against the government. Tell us about Mark Klein and room 641A. What was that? What did it reveal? Why was it such a significant moment?
Yeah. So, after September 11th, we started hearing rumors that there was some kind of massive secret surveillance program happening that the NSA was doing, but we couldn't really get our hands on evidence that we could use in a court case. And then one day in early 2006, a guy literally knocked on the front door of our offices in San Francisco, wearing a trench coat and carrying a bunch of papers. And he said, "Do you guys care about privacy?" And my boss, who answered the door at the time, said, "Well, yes, yes, we do," and invited him in. His name was Mark Klein. He was a newly retired technician from AT&T, and he brought us the schematics of how the mass spying, the tapping into the internet backbone spying that is still going on today, by the way, that is up for renewal in a couple weeks here in Congress. It's called Section 702. But this was the first, when Mark showed up at our door, this was the first hard evidence we had about how the mass spying program that we had been hearing about was actually happening, at the phone companies. Mark had worked at an AT&T building in downtown San Francisco on Folsom Street, not too far from EFF's offices. And he showed up with the actual plan. So this really changed everything because it forced, we were able to bring a lawsuit to challenge this mass spying. And ultimately, because of Mark's work and then later another whistleblower by the name of Ed Snowden, that I suspect people have heard of, we were able to force the government to come clean about the mass spying programs it was doing and that frankly it had been lying about to the American people. And we brought them into the open. We were able to get some reforms. We were able to get some congressional oversight. We were able to get the thing to expire every couple of years, which is what's coming up for FISA Section 702. We were able to get some court oversight, but we weren't able to do the fundamental thing that we wanted to do, which is end it. The court ultimately decided that the program was too secret, that it couldn't be decided by the courts, and has let it continue. And I think that's the big, some big unfinished business that we have. We've made a lot of changes, we've carved it back a lot, but what we really need to do is end it.
In just a moment, the rest of my conversation with Cindy Cohn. Her memoir is titled Privacy's Defender: My 30-Year Fight Against Digital Surveillance. It's River to River from IPR News. I'm Ben Kiefer, and today you're listening to an archive edition of our program. Well, let's get back to the rest of my conversation with Cindy Cohn. Cohn grew up in central Iowa, in Newton. She moved to San Francisco, fell in with a crowd of early internet hackers, and eventually became the leading legal voice of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF, as the nonprofit is known. It fights for our digital rights. And Cindy helped grow EFF from a scrappy group of hackers and lawyers into an organization of more than 120 people. And now she's stepping down as its executive director, and she's written a memoir. The book is titled Privacy's Defender: My 30-Year Fight Against Digital Surveillance. At this point in our conversation, I asked about digital privacy in current times. Let's talk a little bit about the current landscape. You've described the current Trump administration's data consolidation through Doge, through ICE surveillance contracts as a version of what you've always feared. You've called it turnkey totalitarianism. What does that mean, and what's actually happening right now that concerns you most?
Turnkey totalitarianism is actually Ed Snowden's term, but I think it's appropriate. That essentially, we have been worried that if we build all of this surveillance capability and all of this ability to collect information about us and then analyze it and use it in ways that we can't control, that this would be a tremendous tool for a government that really wanted to abuse its citizens or even subsets of its citizens. It would be a real danger to our rights. And we've seen bits of this over time. I want to be clear. I have sued every administration going back to the Clinton administration. But I do think that we're seeing a willingness of the government to marshal all of this information about us that they have been gathering over the years in ways that are increasingly divorced from basic human rights protections, civil liberties protections, and law. And so one of the examples of this is this presidential executive order that says it's going to get rid of silos of information, government silos. This is the kind of philosophy that if the government collects information about us for one purpose, like the IRS collecting information from us in order for us to pay our taxes, that information should be able to be shared with, say, ICE to decide whether there's going to be immigration enforcement against us, or the Justice Department to decide whether we're going to be investigated for something other than taxes. And these are promises that I think the American people have relied on, that if you tell the truth about your taxes, that information won't be used in any other ways. And we're seeing Social Security information, it has been used to try to help ICE target their raids. We're seeing just all sorts of areas in which all the information that the government collects against us in one purpose is being used for other purposes now without a lot of controls on it or limitations or protections for us. And that's only one piece of it. The other piece that we're seeing a lot more of is the government is purchasing information from the private data brokers that collect us about it on the commercial side. FBI Director Kash Patel just testified in front of the Senate in the last couple of weeks saying, yes, we buy information from the commercial data brokers and the FBI uses it for all sorts of investigations. They are the number one purchaser of information from data brokers now is the government. So this is a moment in which we're seeing, after September 11th, the government was pretty good at collecting a lot of information about us, but they at least initially limited the use of that information to things like national security and stopping terrorists. Then we learned that the FBI was getting access to the information that the NSA was collecting about us. And now we're seeing the government collecting information all across the ways and from commercial companies in order to use it against us. And I think it's a moment where, in some ways, I felt a little like Cassandra, talking about, potential dangers that nobody else could see. I think we're in a moment now where people are starting to see those dangers.
Yeah, and talk a little bit more about, because you've raised alarms about AI being used in consequential government decisions, bail, child removal, sentencing. So,
Yep.
what is the specific danger there? Because the argument for AI, I listen to a lot of these podcasts about where we're headed very quickly. You've heard arguments it's precisely that it removes human bias, so it's better.
Yeah, I think well, first of all, I think that's not really the reality that people are living in right now. We've had an increasing problem, let's just say for facial recognition, which is an AI technology. Early on, the technology was really, really bad at identifying people of color. Why? Because of the way it was trained. And so if you have bias data in, you'll get biased data out, and then you have to do things like adjust model weights and do all sorts of things on the back end to try to see if you can squeeze that bias back out again. And so I think it's not magically better. It takes a lot of work. We still see, even though facial recognition technology is better now for people of color, that people of color are still disproportionately misidentified by these systems. And that's because of the people who use the system as much as the systems itself. So
Hmm.
it doesn't magically get rid of bias, period. But it also, introduces other kinds of problems that are hard to track. What I tend to say about AI is it's dangerous when it works and it's dangerous when it doesn't work. It's dangerous when it doesn't work because it can misidentify and it
Yeah.
can hide biases and double down on biases that already exist either in the underlying data or the underlying system that it gets put on top of. And it's also dangerous when it's perfectly good in that it's only as, it won't magically protect your rights. If the people who are using it have decided that they're going to use it to, identify, everybody who has a green card in Iowa City so that they can revoke people's green cards, like the technology is going to be really good at doing that. And it's not going to correct for the biases the users of the system might have.
Yeah, you use, well, there is this phrase predictive policing when we're talking about AI. It sounds neutral, even beneficial. Predictive policing, what could be bad about that? So we have police departments using these tools. And it reminded me, this part about it, Philip K. Dick novel made into a 2002 film starring Tom Cruise. I'm sure you've seen it, Minority Report,
Absolutely.
where John, played by Tom Cruise, works with a pre-crime police, which stops crimes before they take place. But that's what we're talking about here, and that's where it could go. What would that look like in practice? Do you think we're really headed for something like that?
Well, look,
Predictive?
there was a company that was trying to do this. It was called Predictive Policing. I think they changed their names after the outcry about it. But yeah, I think that people are trying to sell people on the idea that a technology can solve social problems. And, we just haven't found one yet that doesn't replicate it. And predictive policing is a good example because what predictive policing did was it had the police put in what they do all day and where the police think crime is likely to happen, and then it would just run analysis on that and spit out to the police where they should go monitor for crime. So in some ways they called it predictive policing, but it was really predicting the police, right? It was just doubling down. If the police thought that a Latino area of town was a place that they had to watch more closely, the predictive policing algorithm would just spit that right back out at them, and it would have the imprimatur that it came out of a machine, but it was really just spitting their own biases back at them. Now we know the actual analysis of where crime happens shows that it happens pretty predictably in all places. It's not neighborhood based. That tends to be based on bias. We know this particularly about drug use, for instance. Drug use is something that is very widely shared. It doesn't have a significantly higher percentage in white communities over black communities over brown communities. But yet, if you look at what the police do in enforcement, they over police in black and brown neighborhoods and under police in white neighborhoods. So the technology just replicates that problem. And in fact, in some analysis that some friends of mine at a group called Human Rights Data Analysis Group did, shows that if you add the algorithm on top of what the cops do, it doesn't just replicate what they do, it doubles down on it. So it makes it the problem worse because the neural networks are looking for patterns. So if they see a pattern, they'll identify it and double down on it. So you adding the computer in, you're actually making biases work. And again, there are tools that people use to try to combat that, but you have to recognize that you're going to start from the place where you're replicating or making the biases work, and then you have to work backwards to try to get something back towards fairness. And once you look at that, then I think you begin to get a little more skeptical of just like add technology equals no bias.
Hmm. Spending the final few minutes in conversation with Cindy Cohn, a native of Newton, Iowa, outgoing executive director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Her new memoir, Privacy's Defender, My 30-Year Fight Against Digital Surveillance. Let's talk about EFF. You've said that the executive director, I understand, was never really your dream job. You're more of a warrior than a manager. What now? What is getting back into the fight, if that's what's in your future, actually look like for you?
I'm not sure. I don't want to jump too quickly. I kind of want to see the opportunities that come up. But yeah, I like to litigate. I like to be, more directly in the fight, and I'm looking for opportunities to do that. I'm talking with a bunch of organizations and people to see where there's a good fit with my skills.
Hmm.
Um, and it's needed. I mean, we're in a time in our society right now where we do need to fight to save our rights and to protect our government. And so I feel like there's lots of opportunities, and I just have to figure out the right one. The good news is that EFF has now announced who the new executive director is going to be. Her name is Nicole Ozer, and she is fabulous. I'm very excited. EFF is going to be in really good hands. And so that makes me feel comfortable that I can kind of get myself a little closer to the fight, maybe be the person who stands up in the courtroom again or the person who writes the briefs again.
Hmm.
I am a litigator. I like to be in court, but maybe that won't be where I end up. But, once I became the executive director, I really wasn't able to do a lot of that. And so I'm excited to jump back in, and I'm really excited to see what EFF's next chapter is going to look like with Nikki at the helm.
Yeah. What would it actually look like if we, those interested in protecting privacy rights, won? If privacy protections that you've been fighting for decades were in place, what would everyday life feel like differently?
I think you could feel comfortable that if, say, the government or a company asked you for information in order to do something, like your phone company has to know where you are when you're traveling around with your phone so that your phone rings where you are, that information wasn't being used for other purposes, that it was being used to serve you in your interest for the thing that you gave it for, and then that's it. It doesn't get to be used for other things, except in a very, very high bar. You could feel comfortable that if there was information about you at your ISP or your bank or anywhere else, that the government couldn't come get it unless they got a warrant from a judge, a probable cause warrant, the old school Fourth Amendment protections, that the Fourth Amendment protected your papers and your things, not just in your house, but when you store them with third parties, which most of us do now in order to live in the modern society. So, and making sure that there wasn't a business model that you could go about your business on the internet, talking with your friends, doing what you want without having anybody watching, writing it down, tracking it, and using it later to decide not just what ads you get, which, of course that happens, but also, what prices you pay or whether you get offered a mortgage or what kind of, housing opportunities you have. I mean, we're increasingly seeing that the data that's collected about us as a side effect of us living our lives, both online and offline, is being marshaled against us.
Hmm.
I think you would be able to feel comfortable that that's not happening, that you can
Hmm.
go talk to your friends, do the things you want to do online, and it's not going to result in you having to pay a higher price for an airfare or a hotel because that information just isn't going anywhere.
And in the final moments here, give us some actionable items. What do you say? What do you reel off really quickly in bullet points, perhaps?
I mean, I think the first thing you need to do is support policymakers who are going to stand with you. Some of these problems they require policies and legal fixes, and you can't do it by just fixing your own privacy settings. But having done that, use tools that are end-to-end encrypted. Check out things like Signal, which is a nonprofit run messaging service. Look at your privacy settings. Try to make sure that they match what you think you want to do, or pick tools that stand with you as best you can. And then, privacy is a team sport. So you should not just think about you and what you do, but think about your community and the people you talk to. I was able to move my girlfriend group from, using a chat for the phone to over to Signal, basically because that way everybody who had an Android and everybody who had an Apple could all talk to each other. But
Mm.
we were able to move over. It wasn't that hard. It still works. And now we all have a lot more protection against data mining and misuses of that information. So there are small things that people can do. EFF has a series of tools called SSD, Surveillance Self-Defense, that are a great place for people to check out and get kind of more precise descriptions about what kinds of protections you might want to take depending on who you are and how to do it.
Okay. And finally, as the author of Privacy's Defender, this memoir, it's out. You've been on tour in Iowa City, Seattle. You were on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. Has anything about how people are responding surprised you, stood out, especially a moment, a comment?
I think the thing that has surprised me is that there is far more appetite for people to think about privacy now. That when I was writing the book, I thought I was going to have to convince people that privacy mattered. What I'm finding when I'm going around is that people understand that privacy matters, but they're missing a framework for it. And they're also just feeling like it's out of their control and there's nothing they can do. So, the good news is I'm hoping that I can help inspire people to think that this is something that is worth standing up for and that they can stand up for it. And to think, I'm trying to recruit people. I'm pretty straightforward about that in the book, especially for younger people who are thinking about how they want to spend their career, that this is, a good way to spend your life, devoted to something that you care about and working to try to make it a reality, whether that's privacy or anything else.
Cindy Cohen, you've been so generous with your time. It's been such a delight to talk with you and to have your views shared with your fellow Iowans here on River to River. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be coming back to Iowa City this week. And, there's just no place like home, as they say.
All right. Bye now, Cindy.
Bye now.
My recent conversation with Cindy Cohen. Her memoir is titled Privacy's Defender: My 30-Year Fight Against Digital Surveillance. Today's show was produced by Caitlin Troutman. Technical assistance from John Pemble. I'm Ben Kiefer. Thanks for joining us.